Good afternoon and welcome. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge that as a result of COVID-19, many of us have had to make significant changes in our lives. NAPW, we send our condolences to any of you who've lost someone in the recent months, and we want to thank you for being able to keep loving and keep working for justice and fairness in these difficult times. I'm Lynn Paltrow, founder and executive director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women. I am actually obeying the New York State stay-at-home orders. Because I can't go to our office, I had to move back to NAPW's original office, which is my bedroom. It may not look like it, but we built an office around the bed, which is over there, and it has come in handy during these times. NAPW is a nonprofit advocacy organization. We see our work as part of a larger collective effort to achieve civil rights, human rights, and reproductive justice for all. We believe that no one should fear arrest, detention, forced medical interventions, or family separation because of pregnancy or any outcome of pregnancy, whether that's birth, pregnancy loss, or an abortion. To that end, we provide pro bono legal support to people where pregnancy is the excuse for the arrest or other punitive intervention. We also do public education, organizing, and research, all of which brings us to this webinar today. In 2013, NAPW published a groundbreaking study. And I'm going to share my screen. And in this was the study, Arrests and Forced Interventions on Pregnant Women in the United States from 1973, when Roe v. Wade was decided, till 2005, the implications for women's legal status and public health. Jeanne, Flavin, and I documented the fact that the overwhelming and disproportionate targets of arrests were low-income women, women of color, and particularly African-American women. Since 2005, a number of researchers have been documenting arrests of women in relationship to their pregnancies, including NAPW. And with the attention that has shifted from the use of I should go back and say that in our study, we found that not all of the arrests were associated with pregnancy and drug use, but 84% of them were cases in which the allegation was the woman had been pregnant and had used one or more controlled substances, usually cocaine. Today, since 2005, attention shifted from cocaine to the use of methamphetamine and the use of opioids. And in that process, the targets of the arrests in relationship to pregnancy change, so that those targets, the majority of women arrested in relationship to their pregnancies, and presumably it seems proportionate to their percentage of the population, are white women, often from rural areas of the country. And this includes Chelsea Becker, who is currently sitting in a California jail on the charge of murder of a human fetus because she experienced a stillbirth that the prosecutor, without scientific basis, claims was caused by her methamphetamine use. NAPW and I are honored to have Professor Khiara M join us in this webinar that examines the shift in who's targeted and who's arrested, helps us understand why that shift has happened, and most importantly, what we can learn about white privilege from that shift. Professor Bridges is a professor of law at UC Berkeley School of Law. She's written many articles concerning race, class, reproductive rights, and the intersection of the three. She has written numerous books that I hope we'll get to talk about during our question and answer period. She is graduated as valedictorian from Spelman College, receiving her degree in 3 years. She received her JD from Columbia Law School and her PhD with distinction from Columbia University's Department of Anthropology. She hasn't been mentioning this, but also she has done extraordinary work as a contemporary ballet dancer. She also is a member, a much appreciated member of NAPW's board. She's talking today. The title of the webinar is also the title of her most recent published law review article, Race, Pregnancy, and the Opioid Epidemic, White Privilege, and the Criminalization of Opioid Use During Pregnancy. For those of you who are not law students or lawyers, it's published in the Harvard Law Review, which is a really big deal. All of her work is a really big deal. That's something that makes us so appreciative of all the work she does. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Lynn, for that stellar introduction. And also thanks to NAPW for organizing this webinar and giving me an opportunity to speak to the participants today. And of course, thank you to the participants for spending an hour of your time looking at a screen and sharing these ideas with me. And so I'm really excited about engaging with the ideas in the article, Race, Pregnancy, and the Opioid Epidemic. And engaging with Lynn with the ideas in the article, but also engaging with the participants. So please do use the Q&A function, and not the chat function, but the Q&A function to direct questions to Lynn and me. So with that, let me share my screen, and I want to just spend the next 20 minutes or so just giving a quick overview of this article that I've written. So the article asks the question, what does the concept of white privilege mean in light of the fact that so many white people are not doing particularly well? And when I say that many white people are not doing particularly well, I have in my head the white folks in Appalachia who are struggling with intergenerational poverty. I have in my head the white communities in the Rust Belt who have watched the industries that they used to rely on for jobs disappear, right? I have in my head the white folks in communities like Brockton, Massachusetts. I just moved from Boston, right? And so Brockton, Massachusetts is this, largely white community outside of Boston that has been hit hard by the opioid epidemic, right? So are those white people who are unemployed, impoverished, struggling with substance use disorders, do those white people have white privilege? And so how we answer that question is incredibly important. If we answer the question in the negative, if we say no, white people who are disadvantaged do not have white privilege, then we have to conclude that in the light of the undeniable fact of widespread white disadvantage, that white privilege does not exist for many, if not most, white people. If, on the other hand, we say, yeah, disadvantaged white people have white privilege, then we have to answer the question of what, as in, what did white privilege do for them? So in my article, I propose that disadvantaged white people have white privilege. And the argument is that white privilege can lead to disadvantageous results just as capably as it leads to advantageous ones. So in this way, I describe white privilege as a double-edged sword. And if we think of white privilege in this way, it may help us understand how white privilege can coexist with white disadvantage. Indeed, it might help us understand how white privilege actively produces white disadvantage. As I see it, white privilege opens lots of doors, even the doors that lead to bad outcomes. So that's the setup for the article. So just to let you know what I plan to do for the next 20 years. I think I told you, Lynn, 15, but I couldn't resist taking an extra 15 minutes, rather 5 minutes to lay out the article in its fullness. So I'll first talk about the criminalization of substance use during pregnancy, focusing on opioid use during pregnancy. And that provides the context of my exploration of the concept of white privilege. Then I'll discuss the most popular formulations of the concept of white privilege. And then I'll discuss 2 insights about white privilege and whiteness generally that I arrive at in the article. Now, I do arrive at 4 insights in the article, 4 insights about white privilege, but I'm just gonna, in the interest of time, I'll only talk about 2 today. So starting with the criminalization of opioid use during pregnancy, historically speaking, Black women have borne the brunt of the criminalization of substance use during pregnancy. It was during the crack cocaine scare of the 1980s and 1990s that states first turned to the criminal legal system to address the phenomenon of substance use during pregnancy. Because that drug scare disproportionately impacted poor Black people, poor Black women overwhelmingly were the targets of prosecutors' efforts to jail those who use substances during pregnancy. Black women were the face of the criminalization of substance use during pregnancy. And it is from this era, from the 1980s and 1990s, that we get the disturbing statistics documenting the overrepresentation of women of color among those facing criminal charges for substance use during pregnancy. And so there was one study that looked at the folks who were arrested in South Carolina between 1989 and 1992 for charges involving substance use during pregnancy. 40 out of 41 women arrested during that time in South Carolina were Black. There was another study that reviewed the police records in 25 states during the crack cocaine scare and revealed that 70 to 80% of the women who were arrested for substance use during pregnancy were, quote, members of minority groups, primarily Blacks and Hispanics. And then, of course, there is a study that Lynn Paltrow did with Jeanne Flavin that documented that over half of women who were arrested for substance use during pregnancy between 1973 and 2005 were Black, which is to say, historically speaking, prosecutions for substance use during pregnancy have tended to fall on the shoulders of Black women. However, there has been a shift because the opioid epidemic has hit white communities particularly hard. White women have come to predominate among those who have been arrested and prosecuted for using substances while pregnant. And so Tennessee provides a good example of this change in the racial demographics. Wendy Bach, who is a friend and also a professor at the University of Tennessee College of Law, she documents that of the women whose race was known and who were prosecuted under Tennessee's fetal assault law between the law's passage in 2014 and its expiration in 2016, 83% of those women were white. Indeed, the first person prosecuted under that Tennessee fetal assault law was a white woman who had used methamphetamine during her pregnancy. Grace Howard, who's also another brilliant scholar, and she's a professor at San Jose State University, she observed something similar in South Carolina. And she writes that here, Black defendants outnumber white defendants through 2003. However, after 2003, the demographic composition of women arrested for pregnancy-related crimes in the state shifted dramatically. And in 2014, the ratio of white to Black defendants in South Carolina was 16-1. And there's also been a shift in Alabama in the racial demographics of those who have been arrested for substance use during pregnancy. Howard states that 83.33% of the people arrested for whom race could be determined were white. And Black women made up only a small minority of the defendants in those cases, and that reflects their general representation in the jurisdictions where prosecutions are taking place. And Bach concludes that what is true in Tennessee, South Carolina, and Alabama is true across the nation. She confirms a shift in the overall racial makeup of these prosecutions. And so knowing this, reading this, led me to ask the question, what are we to make of the fact that being white has not been able to protect white women from the muscularity of the US's criminal legal system? What do white privilege and whiteness mean when they cannot protect white people from excessive, indeed abusive, state power? So it might be helpful to think about how scholars have thought about white privilege. Most progressive scholars define white privilege as a phenomenon that advantages white people, right? So white privilege advantages white people. And they assert that the evidence that white privilege exists and meaningfully impacts white lives is pretty much everywhere, right? So even in the throes of a drug crisis, the opioid epidemic that is shortening white lives, white people can still expect to live longer on average than Black people, right? White women still have a better chance of surviving pregnancy and childbirth than do Black women. The babies that white women birth are still more likely to survive their first year of life than those born to Black women. In terms of morbidity, non-white people tend to be sicker than their white counterparts, right? So we have hypertension, asthma, heart disease, all major common illnesses much more frequently than our white counterparts. And these facts are taken to affirm that white privilege is real. Me, perhaps being a contrarian, I wonder then about the tens and thousands of white people who die from opioid overdoses every year. Do they have white privilege? What about the hundreds of white people who die during pregnancy, childbirth, and the postpartum period? Do they have white privilege? What about the thousands of white babies who die before their first birthdays every year in this country? White privilege? And what about the hundreds of thousands of white people who have hypertension and asthma and heart disease and all the major common illnesses, right? Do those white people have white privilege, right? So if white privilege, if we define it in a way that white privilege is supposed to invariably lead to positive outcomes, then those white folks who are suffering some really bad outcomes do not have white privilege. Now, some thinkers have confronted the fact that white people also suffer bad outcomes, and they said, well, you know, white privilege does not refer to actual advantages, but rather the statistical likelihood of being advantaged. So political theorist Joel Olson argues that white privilege is just probabilities, not guarantees. Right? So if so, then white privilege is not evidenced by the fact that any particular white person is not incarcerated, for example. Instead, it is evidenced by the fact that a white person is simply less likely to be incarcerated. Again, according to Olson's formulation, white privilege is not demonstrated by a white child not dying during her first year of life. Instead, it is demonstrated by a white child being simply less likely to die during her first year of life than her Black counterpart. So my sort of contrarian, my issue with defining white privilege as the statistical likelihood of being advantaged is that it may be unsatisfying. We're not going to make the incarcerated white guy feel better if we tell him that although he's going to be spending, you know, the next 10 to 20 years in prison, he was less likely to be incarcerated than a Black person, right? The white parents of a dead infant are not going to feel comfort after being told that they are racially privileged because although their child is dead, their child was less likely to die than a Black child. So another proposal about white privilege is that white privilege just might be just mostly psychic or emotional. So Professor Khiara M, I love her, she's at UCLA, again, I love her. She's written this incredibly influential article called Whiteness is Property. And so she describes white privilege as, you know, probably for most white folks at the end of the day, emotional, right? She describes whiteness as a consolation prize. It doesn't mean that you're gonna win, but at least you're not Black, right? That's what white privilege is. So conceptualizing white privilege as intangible is helpful because it might serve to explain how apparently disadvantaged white people can still be racially privileged. This definition of white privilege renders the concept consistent with manifest, and we might add widespread white disadvantage. But I think that understanding white privilege as mostly psychic or emotional for most white people might drain the concept of its meaningfulness. Why does white privilege matter if it cannot do things in society, right? Why should we care about the existence of white privilege if it is a psychic phenomenon unable to affect the material world in any meaningful way? And so in my view, I feel like all of these formulations, and yes, my hand is close to my screen, all of these formulations of white privilege miss the mark because they sort of propose that white privilege has an uncomplicated relationship with positive outcomes. I believe that white privilege certainly influences outcomes, but not always in expected ways. And so here are sort of two conclusions that I reached about white privilege in the article that I wrote. The first conclusion is that white people are at times made vulnerable to disadvantage because they occupy a privileged social location, right? White people are at times made vulnerable, disadvantaged because they have white privilege. This is to say that membership in a race that enjoys a socially dominant status can endanger white people. On these occasions, their white privilege can actively produce disadvantage. And with regard to the criminalization of opioid use during pregnancy, I wonder, right, have prosecutors identified white women who use opioids and methamphetamines during their pregnancies as appropriate targets for arrests and prosecutions because there is a concern that they are ruining their white babies? I wonder, have these white women become a target of state violence, and state violence in the form of criminalization, right, as opposed to help, social services? Have these white women become a target of state violence because the state is concerned with preserving white futures? Do states want to punish white women who use substances during pregnancy because they have risk harm to white babies, and in so doing, risk harm to white people and the white race? Which is to say, I don't think that it is preposterous to claim that contemporary society values white reproduction and white babies more than their white counterparts, more than their non-white counterparts, right? Of course, explicit declarations that white fertility is preferred to non-white fertility are still uncommon. Give it a couple of years, but it's still uncommon in mainstream political and popular discourse. But implicit demonstrations of the different values placed on white and non-white reproduction are plentiful. We can look at the reluctance with which the welfare state supports disproportionately non-white families. We can look at the aggressiveness with which the state separates and dissolves non-white families. We can look at the way that non-white fertility figures in cultural narratives as a source of social problems, right? Anchor babies, welfare queens, right? The list goes on and on. So insofar as society prizes white procreation over its non-white counterparts, the higher esteem in which it is held has made white reproduction a site of particular interest to the state. And this interest, in turn, has opened white people up to state violence, this time in the form of prosecutions for opioid use during pregnancy. Does this mean, though, that prosecutions of pregnant Black women for cocaine use during the 1980s and 1990s were a result of the high esteem in which Black reproduction is held? Were they a result of the state's concern about Black babies being ruined by in utero cocaine exposure? Not at all. The focus in the 1980s and 1990s was on how much Black babies who had been exposed to cocaine in utero were going to cost society. The fear back then was that Black women were giving birth to future super predators. The fear back then was that Black women were giving birth to future welfare queens and drains on society. The prosecutions in the 1980s and 1990s did not evidence a disappointment that Black women had ruined their perfect Black babies. They evidenced an anger that Black women would give birth to the future social problems of America. And the second conclusion that I reach in the article is that white privilege can be attenuated by non-white disadvantage. And so I'll explain this. In the 1980s, during the crack cocaine scare, the nation was confronted with a frightening drug scare and the possibility that infants were being irreparably harmed by a substance that was decimating communities. Society chose to address that phenomenon with the criminal system. Moreover, society chose that path and rejected less punitive alternatives, in part because the phenomenon was racialized as Black. More than 3 decades later, the nation faces an equally frightening drug scare and the possibility that infants are being irreparably harmed by a substance that is decimating communities. The thing is, we have a racist precedent for dealing with this very situation. This racist precedent constrains the ability of society to imagine and implement different mechanisms for addressing the phenomenon. As a nation, we might have path dependence, and the racist path that we generated in the 1980s has led us to be punitive towards a population that, due to its racial privilege, might have escaped our nation's punitive inclinations. which is to say in the 1980s, when faced with the fact of pregnant women who used and were dependent on substances, we chose the path of prosecution. And we made this choice in part because so many of those women were Black. And throwing these women in jail was politically acceptable and desirable because they were Black. Now, in the early decades of the 21st century, we have a racist model to guide us in managing the social problem of pregnant women who use and are dependent on substances. White women facing criminal charges for opioid use during pregnancy may just be reaping the bitter seeds of a racism that was sowed by the government and that was directed towards and designed for people of color. So that's another conclusion that I draw. And I'll actually leave it there because I've talked enough and I'm sure we have a lot to talk about. So I am eager to share these ideas with you, Lynn, and with the participants and to talk about them. And so just a reminder to all the participants, if you have a question for me, please, for Lynn and me, please use it, the Q&A function and not the chat function because we won't be monitoring that very closely. So I'll stop.
Oh, thank you. That was amazing and very much appreciated. One of the, I was able to keep a little bit of track in the chat box. And one of the questions that came up was asking why you use the distinction advantage and disadvantage rather than class.
Because I don't think that we're necessarily, I don't think that advantage and disadvantage tracks class perfectly. I think that there are class privileged folks who are disadvantaged. There are a whole bunch of class privileged folks who are struggling with substance use disorder and opioid use disorder specifically. And this is in light of the fact that opioids were made readily available to anybody who asked for them, essentially, before the crisis kind of became apparent as one. And I talk about advantage versus disadvantage as opposed to class privilege versus not class privileged, because I'm trying to capture the multiplicity or the various forms in which disadvantage manifests. So if you think about, the deaths of despair, Deaton and the economist, right? They talk about deaths of despair as a consequence of essentially disappointment, right? The fact that people have not been able to achieve what they thought that they were going to achieve. They haven't done better than their parents did. And I think that is something that crosses class lines. I think that those who are class privileged can also experience disappointment with the present that they have, that they are confronting, and as a result thereof turn to opioid use as well as suicide to address the disappointment.
Thank you. One of the things you said that I heard in a particular way is when you talked about Alabama and Chris Howard's research and talked about it as a shift. And actually, there were really almost no arrests of pregnant women for anything before 2006. And interestingly, one of the few arrests that occurred there was a white woman. I believe it was cocaine. And I helped represent her. And I remember her saying, I think they've targeted me as a white woman so they can set a precedent for arresting Black women later. It's not how it's turned out. The Alabama's arresting the most women, and the shift to predominantly white women really does become as a result of the numbers there and in South Carolina and Tennessee. It was interesting too, Dr. Debbie Frank put up a message saying, but there is a lot of medical literature claiming harm from opioids. But in your article, you talk about sort of an overall in popular media being less dehumanizing. And I think that's probably right, but just to share, there have been a bunch of recent arrests in Oklahoma, white women, in which a local doctor, and that's always the case, the media goes to the local doctor who's done no research, and he describes these babies, and this is methamphetamine, as likely to be mentally defective. Right. So we see the same tropes, but as you say, they get established on the backs of Black women, and then it plays out even more significantly. And for me, one of the frustrations is there seems to be more stigma around drug use than even of abortion. And a failure to recognize that if these precedents are established for anybody, they will be used against everybody and not just not those drugs.
So, it's an important point. It's actually something that I've thought about and I've talked to Grace Howard about. And what she observed and what I've observed is that sort of the national media outlets, right? The New York Times, in the article I talk about this, this coverage by Reuters of, substance use or opioid use during pregnancy and NAS, and these national media outlets are less dismissive, or they're less cruel about the possibilities and the futures of infants who have been exposed to opioids in utero than more local outlets. So if you go to, I'm trying to think of a small town, but if you go to a small town newspaper, you go to a sort of a local media newspaper or television station, they're more likely to talk about brain damage to infants. They're more likely to talk about, hopeless and also maybe even expensive drains on society. But when you go to the New York Times and Reuters and, Wall Street Journal and those sorts of outlets, Washington Post, you go to those outlets, you're less likely to see that the cruel language that was used by those same outlets to describe Black babies during the 1980s and 1990s. I think it's really remarkable. The New York Times apologized for its coverage of crack cocaine and crack cocaine exposed babies, right? So the New York Times issued an apology saying that the coverage was mean, misleading, not supported by the science, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's interesting, right? And so the coverage that the New York Times now does, and you were very much a part of a really beautiful story that the New York Times Post wrote last year, I believe it was, about opioid use during pregnancy in light of the opioid epidemic. And it's so interesting to me that the New York Times descriptions of the women who are struggling with opioid use during pregnancy, their description of the babies who have been exposed to opioids in utero, is much kinder, empathetic, less dismissive of their futures, less damning and demeaning. And I find it a little upsetting and very interesting that the New York Times learned to be kind to white folks who are struggling with substance use disorder. That lesson was taught on the backs of Black women in the 1980s and 1990s, right? So if any shift has in fact happened, it's definitely as a result of Black women having had to bear the burdens of teaching that lesson.
Well, I also think one of my questions is, to you, are there practical, concrete things you hope will come from the insights and understanding people get from reading your brilliant article? So,
yeah, well, one of the things that I hope to, one of the reasons why I wrote this article was because I think that it's inaccurate, it's untrue, and it might be politically disastrous not to confront the fact of white disadvantage. I think that we have to come to terms with the fact that not all white people are doing well. Now, that doesn't mean that white people there's no such thing as white privilege, right? It doesn't mean that there's no longer a racial hierarchy in which white people have a superordinate status to non-white folks. Like that's not at all what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that when we pretend that white disadvantage does not exist, when we pretend that all white folks are doing well, it's factually untrue, but then also, again, politically disastrous. I think part of the reason why we're living this hell of an administration right now is because we and our political parties did not confront the fact of white disadvantage. So part of what I hope to come out of this article is to provide a language that will allow us to be honest about the racial geography that this country has established, right? And variations in privilege and unprivilege among that racial geography that we have created. So again, my hope is to provide a language, a tool, a conceptual toolbox that we can think through white disadvantage. Because if we don't, right, we might be facing another 4 to 8 to 16 years of hell. I also wanted to, another one of my hopes with this article is to, so I think that white people should care about non-white disadvantage on a moral, just because it's immoral, right? Because racism is immoral, anti-Blackness is immoral, xenophobia is immoral, Islamophobia is, like, I just think that white people should care because it's what decent humans would do, right? But if you need an incentive to care, if you need to have some skin in the game, then you should care because non-white disadvantage attenuates your advantage. In the article I talk about Jules Netherland and Helena Hansen. Probably everybody I cited in this article is my favorite people, but they're definitely two of my favorite people. And they noted that this isn't the first opioid crisis that we've had. This isn't the first opioid scare. In the 1970s, there was an opioid scare as well, but that scare was centered in communities of color. And what did the country do? Well, they responded as it did in the, during the crack cocaine days. They responded with arrests, prosecutions, let's build more jails. They did not respond with, let's create an infrastructure, let's create a public health infrastructure to deal with what is a public health crisis. And then in the teen years of 2000, we have another opioid scare, and this one is now decimating white communities, right? It's affecting white communities in the way that the one in the 1970s did not. What if we had approached that 1970s public health crisis as a public health crisis? Then we might have a public health infrastructure that could deal with the health crisis that we're dealing with in the teen years of 2000s and now COVID, right? White people are suffering because we failed to create an infrastructure. And the reason why we failed to create an infrastructure was that crisis was affecting communities of color. Non-white disadvantage attenuates white advantage. White folks would be much better off if we as a society cared more about the ills that might affect communities of color.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Some of my learning is historically, many people don't know that our labor movement and the many things that were accomplished, 8-hour workdays, all kinds of things, really came about as a result of organizing by American communists. And what I came to learn is part of the reasons they're so hated and why that label is so effective is because those communists took a position against anti-Black racism. And they worked very hard to bring Black people and white working class people, the disadvantaged white people together, and they were effective. That's why we have the labor laws we have today. And finding a way to see that connection, whether from a moral basis or a pragmatic basis, is essential to us ever getting where we want to go and affecting the next 4, 8, 12 years. Yeah. I think there's also something very specific, practical that I heard from this, which is you're absolutely right that a lot of organizing, some of it by us, a lot of it by Black journalists and activists, were directed toward the major media outlets, the New York Times, the Washington Post. What this suggests is that attention to the local ones, to the extent they're left, is just as important and changeable. But it means really following up every time the local journalist says these children are all going to be damaged, or they only bother to talk to the local pediatrician who's not an expert on these things.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
So thank you for that. Here's another kind of question, something you talk about in your paper that I want you to elucidate a little bit, and that's, and I'm going to make this a little bit personal, who gets to be white? And is it something that's permanent? I was recently and belatedly introduced to the writer, researcher, activist Eric Ward, who has studied white nationalism. And he has pointed out at the core of white nationalism is, he believes, is anti-Semitism. He's a Black man, a researcher. He's been at Ford. He's gone to all sorts of white nationalist things. And white nationalists do not think even today that Jews, for example, are white people. Certainly, we have benefited from appearing white and all of that privilege. But it's not, from my experience, it's very tenuous as we see the response to COVID and the protests in Michigan and elsewhere, not only having racist Confederate things, but also anti-Jewish things.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, yeah. Now, when you're talking, I thought of Charlottesville and these protests about removal of Confederate statues, and the Confederacy being the government that defended to the death, even chattel slavery, the enslavement of Black bodies. And so it was definitely anti-Blackness, swarming the streets of Charlottesville. But one of the things that I remember from coverage of it was they were saying, Jews will not replace us. And I was like, hey, how did the Jews get involved in your anti-Blackness, right? So there's definitely a relationship there. White supremacy subjugates non-white folks, query who is non-white. And I think that Jews certainly have a tenuous hold on whiteness, as you suggested. Who gets to be white? So I approach race as a social construction, right? I think that race, I'm just relying on the weight of good science, and race is not a genetic entity in the sense that there's a Black gene, there's a white gene, there's an Asian gene, there's an indigenous gene, and that's why we have those 4 races. Rather, genetic difference is spread across the globe in a spectrum, and so to divide up that spectrum into 4 or 5 or 18 or 85 discrete races is an exercise in arbitrariness, right? So I believe that race is socially constructed, which is not to deny that it is real. It is very real. Race overdetermines who lives, who dies, who's sick, who's healthy, who has jobs, who does not, whether the country cares about a public health crisis or not, right? So race certainly has very material impacts. If race is socially constructed, which it is, it means that I also approach race as a social construction, not as something that we've inherited from the past. If race exists today, it is not because we created it during the time of chattel slavery, or we created it during the time when we wanted to exterminate indigenous folks and take their land. And then we just sort of, we inherited it from those times. Rather, if race exists today, it's because we constantly create it. We constantly create it. If we constantly create it, it means that we also constantly recreate it, and it can be recreated differently. So I think I like my anthropological brain, my social constructionist brain thinks that viewing the criminalization of opioid use during pregnancy, the arrests and prosecutions of white women for opioid use during pregnancy might be an opportunity to see race as it is being recreated. If Jews have a tenuous hold on whiteness, I wonder whether Chelsea Becker has a tenuous hold on whiteness, right? I wonder whether these women who the state responds to the loss of their infants with felony charges as opposed to kindness and sympathy, and again, social service, I wonder if they have a tenuous hold on whiteness. I think that what these prosecutions do is demonstrate what whiteness is, right? Whiteness is not substance use. Whiteness is not substance use during pregnancy. Whiteness is not, the conditions in which, the folks who are facing prosecution live, are forced to live. And so in identifying what whiteness is not, we might be identifying simultaneously what whiteness is. So, right, there's some racial construction work going on in these prosecutions.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting that so much of the critique of our opponents, and what do I mean by that? Maybe anti-abortion folks and others, is how critical they are and how and inconsistent they are. And I think we sometimes think that by pointing out, exposing that hypocrisy, that they're going to somehow change. But
right.
they're inconsistent and hypocritical because they're just using these issues as to advance their overall agenda, which I think ultimately in the courts is not only to end the right to abortion, but to overturn the civil rights decisions, to really go back to that period of time. There's a question I want to from an anonymous attendee. To what extent is white privilege a useful concept in terms of organizing across race, geography, as well as mobilizing and forming alliances?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I believe that if we, so a lot of people respond to, and let me be precise, a lot of white people respond to the notion of white privilege defensively because it suggests that they're winning, hashtag winning, right? It suggests that, you know, if white privilege exists and all white people have it, then all white people are doing particularly well. And so there might be a failure to empathize with the struggles of non-white folks because white privilege the concept of white privilege has put folks on the defensive. Now, I will say there are a whole bunch of awesome white folks who acknowledge the existence of white privilege and they confront their privilege in their daily lives and they actively work to dismantle the privileges that they have, in as much as those privileges result in other non-white folks' disadvantage. But I do think that the concept of white privilege may have had the effect of alienating white people from the struggles of non-white folks in light of the fact that it suggests that white folks are doing well. That being said, if white privilege is, you know, as I propose in this article, implies a complicated relationship to advantage. If white privilege, as I describe it, can capably leads to advantageous outcomes as it does disadvantageous ones. If that is what white privilege is, then we all should be working to disadvantage white privilege because not only does it harm non-white people, but it also harms white people. And so that could be the stuff, I think, of alliances. That could be the stuff of organizing, right? We're all harmed, differentially so, but all harmed by white privilege, even while some white people are advantaged by it. I actually think the number of white folks who are doing well is just, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And the possibilities for alliances grows in light of the smallness of the number of white folks who are doing well. And I think that white identity works to decrease the possibility of those alliances forming. Because if white people identify with those 1 or 2 to 15 or 1,000 white people who are doing well, then that prevents them from seeing the shared circumstances that they have with all the rest of humanity.
Absolutely. Let me ask another question from Jennifer Kirshner. In terms of the shift in racial makeup of prosecution, was that also seen with convictions or sentences? And I know I have an answer, which is from our study, what we saw is that women of color, Black women, were more likely to be charged with felonies. I don't think we had enough information to determine convictions and sentences because the data isn't organized by the topics that we're looking at, but certainly more likely to be charged with a felony. So likely if they're convicted or inappropriately plead guilty to non-existent crimes, their sentences are likely to be longer. I don't know if any of our colleagues, Wendy Bach and Grace Howard, and were able to document that as well.
Yeah, not so much. So the numbers on convictions versus arrest prosecutions, I think that those numbers are harder to come by. I know that what Wendy Bach has documented, though, is that while white women are, increasingly swept up in this, over just ridiculously muscular criminal legal system that we have in the US, they are, or in Tennessee, right, because she's analyzing Tennessee and specifically the fetal assault law down there, they were being creative. And so there were a lot more opportunities to get out of criminal punishment, even though the criminal law is being used as kind of like a lever to get people into treatment, right? They were using it as a lever to get people into treatment. Now, Bach's critique is that, well, where's the treatment though, right? There was no treatment available, right? And you had to pay for it, and then they weren't, the programs weren't well situated for folks who had children or who were pregnant even. But I think there was more, in light of the willingness to conceptualize the opioid epidemic as a public health crisis as opposed to a problem of criminal justice or a law enforcement problem. There was also a willingness to approach arrests and prosecutions as leading to treatment as opposed to leading to, felony convictions and time in jail.
That was the myth. That was how they sold it. This is going to address the opioid problem, but it's going to give us the power to arrest, people who are not using narcotics, which was a white woman, methamphetamine first arrest. It's not a narcotic. They used it to arrest a woman who attempted to have an abortion. They've used it to arrest women who do anything that they perceived as risky. At least they did during the 2 years it was in effect. One of the things about using white privilege, manipulating it, is, I think, very connected to a disregard for science. So in the context of pregnancy and drug use, none of the criminalized drugs are good, that don't cause permanent harm and are not good they don't cause pregnancy losses. If they did, all the women who can't access abortion services would be using them, and they're not. Those drugs are mifepristone and misoprostol, not methamphetamine or heroin and those things. But there is, I think, a connection in the anti-science that we see around COVID-19, that we see making false claims about risks in abortion and extraordinarily ridiculously exaggerated claims of harm around the criminalized drugs. You have a great section in your article about comparing it to evidence of harm from cigarette smoking, which doesn't lead to arrests. But here's a question I have. You chose to analyze these cases in terms of white privilege. And at the end of your article, you talk more broadly about intersectionality and touch a little bit on male privilege. And I just wondered what you think it might have looked like if you had done the article from the lens primarily of male privilege.
Yeah, so the way that I approach the issue is that, okay, so white privilege is evidenced in the fact, and this is like the old school formulation of white privilege, as in white privilege leading to positive outcomes, white privilege as an advantage. I believe that the country's willingness to address the opioid epidemic as a public health crisis, as opposed to a problem of law enforcement, is a function of white privilege. It's amazing that, I was young in the 1980s, but it never even crossed my mind growing up through the crack cocaine scare to think of addiction as like a neurological, a psychological state of the body, to think of it as like a medical condition. It wasn't floated as a possibility in the 1980s and 90s that this might actually be a medical condition similar to, in the article I say Tourette's or something like that, right? Something that deserves treatment as opposed to punishment. But that's, that is the discourse that's circulating now. I think that evidence is white privilege. So instead of building more jails and prisons, instead of starting, police officer task forces to, nab opioid users, instead we're seeing methadone, Suboxone. We're seeing, safe injection sites, in San Francisco. They're all over the place. That's white privilege. because this is a drug epidemic that's racialized as white. That's white privilege. But if you're pregnant, right? Except if you're pregnant. If you're pregnant, you might just be hit with felony charges. If you lose a pregnancy, you just might be hit with murder charges. So I think this is an example of white privilege being attenuated by the capacity to carry a fetus. And, you know, cisgender women, trans men with uteruses, non-binary people with uteruses, their ability to enjoy white privilege is attenuated by the fact of their capacity to carry a pregnancy. And that's intersectionality 101, right? Is that one's privilege with regard to, I don't know, say, gender, sex, maleness might be attenuated by another of your categories, your race. So Black men have different experiences of power and subordination than white men. White women have different experiences of power and subordination than Black women. And so white people with the ability to carry a fetus to term, or ability to carry a fetus, period, their white privilege would be attenuated by that capacity. So yeah, I think Kim Crenshaw might agree with me on that.
Yes, I'm sure she would. We're getting close to the end of our formal time, although we can go a little bit over. And it turns out that if I take my cursor down, there are way more questions than I realized. So I'm wondering if you're willing to stay a little bit longer, and whether you can see the questions and want to figure out which ones you might want to tackle that I haven't already brought to your attention.
And also, I think Kendall was monitoring the queue as well. Kendall, if you can see any question that you think would be a particularly awesome one to flag, please do.
Well, here's one just shouldn't the fact that white people are now being harmed encourage society to begin to build the health infrastructure? Sad, I know. You know, I've been reading the stories, though, that those white folk who are absolutely harmed by lack of infrastructure seem to still feel okay about it, because at least, yeah, you know, it means that also immigrants and Black people are not going to get it.
Right. I mean, so I think that is the danger. I mean, when I was earlier talking about white identity, like I think white identity is poison, right? When white identity leads you to believe that you are winning by getting rid of things like a welfare state or a safety net, or even a public health infrastructure. To think that you're winning by not wearing a mask in light of a public health crisis in which a virus is airborne, white identity is dangerous, right? It's like a death cult. If white identity leads you to be anti-science and essentially pro-death, then it's a dangerous thing for everyone, including white people.
Absolutely. Let's see. Wendy Bach is watching. Hi, Wendy. Khiara, can you talk more about how the relationship of whiteness and access to the concept of motherhood? It was clear to me in Tennessee that the legislator wanted to exclude the targets of the law from the concept of motherhood.
Yes. So we're talking about good mothers and bad mothers, right? And you know, and there's Dorothy Roberts has done work on conceptions of motherhood and how Black women have been excluded from the domain of good motherhood, of motherhood, period. They were good at raising other people's kids. They were even good at, you know, nursing other people's kids, but raising their own, right? They're not mothers in that sense. Carol Sanger has done really interesting work around the concept of you know, conceptions of motherhood. And so I think that, you know, motherhood is a narrowly defined and also racialized construct. It's narrowly defined in the sense that folks who, you know, for many years, folks who worked outside of the home weren't proper mothers. You know, folks who weren't married to the father of their kids weren't proper mothers. and it's racialized in the sense that white women have had easier access to it than non-white women. And so what you've suggested, Wendy, about keeping white women who use substances during pregnancy from conceptions of proper motherhood is in keeping with, you know, the history of the concept of motherhood. If motherhood is anything, it is not jeopardizing, potentially jeopardizing, right, the health and well-being of a fetus that you're gestating. You're supposed to give your life to carry, you know, to carry a fetus to term, health, you know, in a healthy way. So yes, it's about, I think these prosecutions are about policing a lot of things. I think it's about policing whiteness and also about policing mothers. Like, just let's be clear that a person who will use substances during pregnancy is not a proper mother, and we can respond to that issue as punitively as we possibly can.
So
I thought, yeah, go ahead.
You go ahead.
No, I just saw a question from, it's just the last one at the bottom of the screen, about an opinion about screening for substances at the time of delivery. Yeah, it's an interesting question to me, and I know you have thoughts on it, Lynn, and I want to hear your thoughts as well. I think part of the issue with screening for substances at the time of delivery is that it's differentially done. So right now, there's no sort of broad protocol, definitely not on the federal level, but in terms of best practices to screen new birthing people for substances and the newborns that they birth for substances at the time of delivery. So what healthcare providers do now is do on a case-by-case basis. So if there's some, you know, suspicion maybe about substance use during pregnancy, then we'll screen it. If there's no suspicion about substance use during pregnancy, we won't screen. What that ends up doing is just allowing racism, classism, and biases to affect who gets screened and who doesn't get screened. And so in turn, you find substance use during pregnancy in some communities more than others. So you prove the thing that led you to have the bias in the first place. Michelle Goodwin has done amazing work. I should also shout out Michelle Goodwin's Policing the Womb. She acknowledges the shift in the demographics of those who have faced criminalization as a result of substance use during pregnancy. But she's noted that affluent white women use substances during pregnancy at the same or higher rates than those who are not affluent and white. The substances they use are more likely to be prescribed, sure, but there's still substances that pose an unproven risk to fetuses. So if we had an equal treatment, equality when it comes to screening pregnant folks and delivering folks for substance use during pregnancy, I think we would see much more affluent folks, many more white folks being swept up in this carceral system, or at least being identified as having used substances during pregnancy. And so whether that's good medical practice, right? So the question then is like, is it good medical practice? Do you need to know the substances that someone has been using in order to treat them or to treat their newborn? You know, that's a question for the experts.
And I completely agree. And maybe the next webinar will have some of those folks, but based on talking to folks in the field, there's really very little information that one gets. Why do you need to know if somebody is using certain substances? In the early days, there were treatment improvement protocols that were developed by experts inside of the Substance Abuse Mental Health Administration. And a question to them is, should we be drug testing? And their answer was no, you're not going to get it. There's not a treatment for this. To the extent that babies may have neonatal abstinence syndrome. The argument is if you know the woman was using opioids, receiving medication for opioid treatment, we can provide them with better care. But experts like Dr. Ron Abraham says, look, if a baby's not eating, if a baby has certain symptoms, you have to rule out everything else it could be, and then we know how to treat it no matter what. So you're not getting information that actually leads for most of the medication to drugs to anything that's medically treatable, like an exposure to cigarettes even. It may be a reason why some baby's born smaller, but there's no treatment for it. So we have a situation where we're spending a lot of time talking about who's tested and the bias in the testing, all of which is true. But I think the bigger question is that it's all for social reasons. And the biggest interventions come from the child welfare system that basically does family separation. And again, very, very disproportionately, people of color, Black women, and low-income white women. And we also, we always end up talking about drugs, the ones that have been criminalized, that were criminalized on the backs of people of color, that created the path, whether it was criminalizing cannabis because that would control Mexicans, or opioids because that would control Chinese immigrants, or cocaine that was associated for reasons that have no historic, only for political reasons, with Black people. But we're not talking about lead. Exposure to lead actually causes permanent damage. And it's been proposed that we should have laws in Michigan that say in 20 years from Flint, that it can be a defense that you were exposed to lead if you're accused of certain kinds of crimes. Trump has deregulated so that there's going to be more mercury. We know that mercury causes permanent damage and that fetuses and pregnant women are particularly vulnerable. So we have a very, we can think of one issue at a time, and it makes it very hard to look at the bigger, more damaging picture.
And I just add poverty. Poverty is known to lead to poor birth outcomes. So if we really cared about fetuses, if we really cared about babies, we would work really hard to eliminating poverty in the wealthiest country in the world, right? In one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Instead of doing that, instead of doing the structural work, the hard systemic transformation to eliminate poverty in this country, instead we say 5 to 10 years if you test positive for substances after you've given birth.
Right.
Yeah.
So for any of you who have to go, please do. I think what makes sense? Do you want to stay on for another few minutes until 4:15?
Well, I think that if there's a good way to go through the questions without people having to look at me read the questions, that would be great. Otherwise, I'm happy to go through the questions offline and to respond to folks who are interested.
That's very kind of you.
Yeah.
We've been supported in this webinar by Sean Steiner and Kendall Benson. And Kendall, if you can make sure we don't lose any of these questions. Here's just one more that I thought was from Melissa Belbari. Not sure if relevant, but in California, health disparities are often addressed in terms of white versus Black disparities. The largest disparity is often between Asian and Black women. Is this intentional, relevant?
Well, no, I think that I think that phenomenon of erasing Asian communities and people is part of an entire binary in which we kind of erase non-white, non-Black people, right? So there are other racial minorities out there, right? There are other non-white people. It's not just Black folks. And so Indigenous folks, Asian folks, and and these are such problematic categories in and of themselves, right? Because Asian is a category that elides a whole bunch of heterogeneity within the communities that have come to be racialized as Asian. And so while people of Chinese descent or people of Japanese descent might do well in terms of health outcomes, Hmong, Laotian, Cambodian, Asian folks are at the bottom of most measures of social well-being, right? So the category in and of itself is problematic, but that doesn't mean we should ignore it. But I think a lot of public health work does ignore the other non-white, non-Black communities, and I think that is incredibly problematic.
Okay, and I see there are a couple of questions that ask about the difference between drug screening and drug testing, and I'll just take that for a minute. There are differences. Presumably you don't have a lab result when you do a screening, it's a conversation. I'm suspicious that in practice there's not a lot of difference, because if you believe you're obligated to report to child welfare authorities, which often means a report to police, it doesn't matter, it's not limited to how you got the information, whether it's from a screening or a test. And as you cite Sarah Roberts' work in your article, that even universal screening, you might get a positive tox on everybody. It's very expensive, medically not clear what the value of it is, but still there's discretion in who gets reported. So it turns out that universal screening is a good demand to make from a political perspective, because if you actually test everybody, and it costs that much, it discourages it, but there will still be a racial disproportionality in who gets reported, or a racial disparity in who gets tested in the first place, who gets reported, but maybe less so now. Part of what we hear when the rural poor women is that they're known in the community. Oh, that one who uses drugs. So they're tested when they come in because everybody in the community knows who they are and they're targeted in that way. So I think we should close. Very generous of you to offer to answer the questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. Do you want to say anything in closing?
No, thank you again to you, Lynn, to NAPW, to Kendall and Jeanne at NAPW for pulling this all together. And thanks, of course, to all the participants for spending time. The article is out. It's available. It's on Harvard Law Review's website if you want to check it out. It's long, but yeah, please do send me an email if I can answer any question that I didn't answer today.
And I think somebody in the chat box generously posted the link, and I'm sure we have a way to make sure people, as a follow-up, will be able to see the link. They can access it, and they don't have to belong or have gone to Harvard to read it.
No.
Thank you so much, Professor Bridges, for all that you do and the brilliance you bring to it. And thank you, everybody. Please stay safe, healthy, and well. And I guess go wash your hands. Thank you.